Hi and welcome back to Chapter 3, Firms in the Marketplace, Background to Supply. This is the second video of 2 for this chapter. And the idea is to find out more about supply, the supply curve. In fact, deriving the supply curve. Yeah, we're in Chapter 3, Firms in the Marketplace. That makes sense. And if we look at the table of content, our focus in this video is going to be the part 3.4, 3.5, 3.6, which on the one hand means the output decision in the short run. And this is another word for talking about the supply curve. And then basically chapter 3.6, the nature of productivity and costs in the long run. We heard about the short run, only one variable factor is flexible. In the long run, all production factors are flexible. And this is what we are going to focus on. Yeah, we are still on our way. These are the slides that you already know from the first video. Still on our way of maximizing profits. And this conclusion that we only mentioned briefly at the beginning of the last video, this conclusion that we need the marginal revenue to be equal to the marginal cost, that's something which will be important, of course, in chapter 5, but it's also important here to understand as a reason, as a determinant of the output decision of firms. So let us have a look here to this step which is described at that point and follow up at that point. Maximizing profit, maximizing the difference between total revenue and total costs, is something that we are going to do in different ways. Here, let's have a brief look from the mathematical point of view, from the algebraic point of view. If we have an equation, which is profit is total revenue minus total cost, and we want to maximize this, then we typically use the first derivative and set this first derivative equal to 0. And we write this in that way, that we have the equation total profit is total revenue minus total cost. We want to maximize this. We take the first derivative, set it equal to 0, and the first derivative we could either use the that sign here and call it prime, so pi prime, or another word would be marginal profit, should be 0. You see in both equations that there's this exclamation mark above the equal sign, and that says it has to be 0. We are looking for this situation where this equation holds, where the first derivative is equal to 0. Okay, profit should be equal to 0, and we said profit is total revenue minus total costs. When we derive this, then we could either say pi prime equals total revenue prime minus total cost prime, but that's already the same as marginal revenue and marginal cost. That should be 0. So that's just the symbols that we use, whether we use the prime or we say marginal. And obviously, in this equation, we can bring one of those to the other side. Marginal revenue minus marginal cost is 0. That's equivalent to marginal revenue equals marginal costs. As our condition of the maximum, mathematically speaking, the first order condition for a maximum. Let's take this home with us. Let's keep this in mind, as this first order condition of maximizing any function will be something that we encounter at different parts of the class, and at the end it also reminds you of things that you discussed in your maths class where you already did this maximization. This condition is the basis for the firm's decision making, whether they want to supply a specific good and what quantity of that specific good, by comparing the costs with the revenue. And the most important driver of the revenue is the price. So we come here again to a function. We had the demand function in chapter 2, and here we talk about the supply function. Quantity supplied as a function of the price. This function reminds us on the demand function as does the definition down there, the plans of the producers. You might recall in the last video, in the second video of chapter 2, we talked about this consumer surplus. And there we said that the demand curve is about the plans of the consumers, the willingness to pay of the consumers. And now here we have it sort of the other way around. We look at the plans of the producers. We could say the willingness to supply, the willingness to sell of producers. Okay, to approach the supply curve, let us briefly have a look back at the end of our last video, where we derived the different cost functions, and we ended up with this message here that says average costs are intersected by marginal cost in their minimum. And let's go back to this argument in order to understand how we can derive the supply curve. We do this by continuing our journey through the book, and we open subchapter 3.4, output decision in the short run. Here you can see this figure that describes again the relation between marginal cost and average cost. And I'd like us to have a closer look to this. The first question that we would like to look at is, why is that so? This definition that the average costs are intersected by the marginal costs in their minimum. And that holds, by the way, for the average variable costs as well as the average total costs. To approach this question 1, let us compare the two functions. We have the average cost, and for a certain production of 50, of 100, of 150, we see that in fact the average cost is bigger than the marginal cost. What does that mean? If you run a company, if you run a firm and you want to make the decision whether or not to produce something, if you produce 50 units and compare this to the situation where you, let's say, produce 100 units, each unit would be cheaper to make. Which means, yes, we do this. If we are at 50, let's do 100, because then the average cost goes down from, what is this, 0.3, and then it goes down to 0.7, it goes down to 0.5 or whatever. So the costs go down because the marginal cost, the cost of producing one more unit, is lower than the average. And that leads the average costs to go down. And the message is produce more. If we produce more, we bring down our costs. When we now compare this to the situation on the right-hand side, the situation on the right-hand side of this intersection, there it's the other way around. The marginal costs are higher than the average costs. So for each and every additional unit that I make, my costs per unit increase. So we see that the intersection between the two graphs, between average cost and marginal cost, has to be the minimum of average cost. Because on the left-hand side, average costs go down. On the right-hand side, average costs go up. That means in the middle, we have the minimum, which I tried to write down as a conclusion here. So that was the first question. And let's go to the second part, how to derive the supply curve. That's already the title up here, deriving the supply curve. What is the firm's decision here? And we already find information in our graph with that sentence: below the short-run average variable costs, the firm shuts down. Below, in the sense of if the price that can be achieved on the market, if that price is below the average cost, then this firm would definitely make a loss. So on the one hand, I added here that this axis, the vertical axis is an axis about money. It might be pound, it might be euro, it might be dollar, whatever. So we can add that it's also about the price. We can not only put the average cost and the marginal cost, but also the price on this vertical axis. And you further see that I added a horizontal line here depicting different prices. So if the price on the market is down here, so for that good that I produce, I can get whatever that is, 0.15 or 0.1, 10 cents. But my production costs are, for all levels of my production, they are in a minimum of, let's say, 25 cents. That doesn't make sense. We don't produce here below average cost, the firm shuts down. So a positive decision to produce only starts when the market price is at least the average cost. This is here that point in the minimum of the average cost that sort of a positive decision of, yes, we are going to produce something is going to start. But of course, the firm would like to earn a bit more in order to be able to make profit. If the price is exactly the average cost, then you could produce and you would earn the income that you need, but you wouldn't make profit. Nevertheless, we are in this situation above short-run average variable costs. The firm short-run marginal cost curve becomes the supply curve. So here is supply, and now why is that the supply curve? Let's say we have a market price of 0.5, 50 cents. Then the firm would say, that's fine, I can earn 50 cents, which is exactly the same, looking at the marginal cost, exactly the same what it costs me to produce one more unit. And it's more than it cost me before to produce the other units, because the average cost is relatively low as compared to the market price. But recalling, let's go here to the 1, recalling the mathematical or the algebraic derivation that we just did, we said what the firm needs to take into account in order to think about, do I produce or do I not produce, is the marginal cost. It compares the marginal revenue, and in fact the price is the marginal revenue. If I sell one more unit, what is it that I get? And here I compare this with, if I produce one more unit, what does it cost me? And in fact, at a price of €1, the firm would say, hey, we produce 230 units. At a price of 150, the firm would say, I earn more, so I can make more units. I'm willing to supply 250, 260, let's see. Oh, that might be 255 or something like this. And that is going to hold for each and every point of the short-run marginal cost curve. And this is why this short-run marginal cost curve becomes our supply curve. This upper part, it starts here in this point, and then this upper part, that's the supply curve of a firm. That's the decision of a firm to produce the goods and then offer them on the market based on the price that can be achieved on the market. And let me be a bit lazy and just copy the text down here, the text that we already read. Above this short-run average variable cost, this part becomes the supply curve, an upward sloping line that also in the next chapter, when we compare the downward sloping line of demand with the upward sloping line of supply and then check where the two intersect, that's the basis that we just laid here. Third argument, or third aspect here, to derive the market supply curve, this is the sum of all the individual supplies of the single firms. Which I hope makes sense, that if you have thousands of firms, 10,000s of firms that individually decide on this basis, and follow this supply curve, that all the individual supplies have to be added up. The first firm wants to supply 500, the second firm wants to supply 1,000, the third firm wants to supply 1,500. I add all these up and come to 3,000 as the supply at one specific price. The next slide in our presentation shows this. Figure 3.8 represents exactly this. At a given price, let's say of £5, the firm 1 is willing to produce or to supply 1,000 units. Firm 2 is willing to supply 1,500, and we have to add this up, all the firms. Of course, we have tens of thousands normally, but here we just take 2, and then we come at the price of 5 to a market supply of 2,500, and the same at a price of 10. First firm supplies 2,000, second firm supplies 3,000, and then our market supply is 5,000. And that's the way we derive the market supply curve that is defined also here. The supply curve represents the positive relationship between the price of a product and the firm's willingness to supply. There is again the term that we have been using in the last chapter. We use it here, the willingness to supply. It's about the plans of the producers. Deriving the market supply function as the sum of the individual supply functions of the single firms. And I also copied the definition that we just saw on the slide. The supply curve represents the positive relationship between price and quantity, the firm's willingness to supply them. Let's take this frame again as something we take with us into the next chapters, that when in future we talk about the supply function, the willingness to supply by the firms, then we have an idea where this concept comes from. Going ahead, we're not going to focus on chapter or part 3.5, but 3.6, productivity and cost in the long run. Again, our definition was, in the short run, there's only one variable factor, one production factor variable, and in the long run, all production factors are variable. So we could go back to our pizzeria and the arguments that we brought forward, that we said, okay, it doesn't help the firm, it doesn't help the pizzeria to employ more people, to have more employees, because it's just not enough space. There's only a limited space in the kitchen and also out there in the restaurant, and there's only one oven. And in only one oven, it's not possible to make more than a certain amount, let's say more than 20 pizza in a certain time period. In the long run, it's possible to change this. If the pizzeria is successful, you are a manager of this pizzeria, you would say, hey, we make a lot of money at the moment. We could even make more if we had more capacity. And the simple solution to this is to add more capacity, to buy a second oven, to perhaps check whether it's possible to change this kitchen, to remove other rooms and be able to produce more, or just move to another location or rent a second restaurant. That's when firms grow. They are able to reduce their costs. Basically, we could say their whole cost functions. And you see the arguments here in the long runs of all factors are variable. They can buy more machines and so on. And therefore, the law of diminishing returns that we defined in the last video does not totally determine the productivity of a firm, but in the long run, they can increase all the production factors. And this is a concept that we call returns to scale. Positive, negative returns to scale. You might have come across the term or the concept in other classes as well. We differentiate these increasing, decreasing, or constant returns to scale. You see the definitions here. And let us illustrate this again. Illustrating, we can do that with using the figure 3.10, but I'd like to try on my own to illustrate this a bit more in a diagram in our Miro whiteboard. New frame number 3, about 3.6. In the long run, an illustration. With a short review, this down here is the shape of an average cost curve, whether it's the average variable cost or the average total cost. It's basically a U-shaped function. It's a function that first goes down, has a well-defined minimum, and then goes up. This minimum we can find by looking at the intersection between the average cost and the marginal cost. But the most important message, first of all, is it's U-shaped. Short run average total cost 1, and that means that our pizzeria, if we go down here, we can see they might be able to produce 500 pizza an evening, or let's say 300 pizza an evening with that cost structure, because we heard they are not going to produce at other situations, and they have, of course, to compare this with the market price, but that's what we look at here. And this Q is output, so that's at the end the size of the firm. We can measure the size of the firm with different indicators. We can take the number of employees, we can take the revenue and so on, and here we just say the amount of output. Now, we said if you are the manager of that firm, you would like to increase the profit. You see that, yes, okay, wonderful, I can in fact make a profit, but this profit, this is limited to my production capacities. So I buy another oven. That's the first idea. So you get a new short run average total cost. Average cost, that's the important message here, which is lower if you produce more. Now you can increase the size of your firm. So the second oven might do its role for some time, but then you see there are still more customers, they would still buy more of my pizza, so it might be better to go to a bigger place or rent another restaurant and so on in order to increase furthermore. And that might work for some time. You buy a second restaurant, you buy a third restaurant and so on. And then when you start doing the fourth, the fifth restaurant, you might come across the effect that you no longer have positive economies of scale, but it might stagnate, or it might even go in the other direction. It might go up again. So what we see here is that the overall picture that we observe is relatively similar to the individual one, because what we get is sort of a long run average cost that again first goes down, then goes up, and is a U shape, just a bit bigger than the one we saw here. There are definitely artists or people out there who can draw better than I can and who can make more beautiful and more instructive graphs. Nevertheless, I hope that the basic message might be coming over here, that we have a part where when we increase the size of a firm, then the cost become lower, my efficiency is better, and we call this economies of scale. So this downward part of the cost function, that the costs become lower when the firm grows bigger, is called economies of scale. And then there is a neutral part, and after that part costs go up again, and we talk about diseconomies of scale. Of course, all firms would like to be here in the part where we have positive economies of scale, so where the graph goes downward, increasing the amount produced, getting new places to produce, buying new factories, or buying other firms. Mergers and acquisitions, all these are possibilities to increase the efficiency of firms by exploiting economies of scale. Now, back from my graph to the pictures that we find in the book. The figure 310 goes a bit in this direction and shows how it goes down here. The figure 311 shows this envelope here as the long run average costs, and then the short run, the different short run average costs in this graph. It's not total, it says here average cost, so it's a short run average total cost and long run average total costs. There are different reasons for economies of scale, and some of them are listed here on this slide. These are, of course, only some bullet points. You find more information about this in the book, or you might as well research what are economies, or what are the reasons for economies of scale or diseconomies of scale. Why does this process turn around? Why is it for a certain time, if I become bigger, if I grow, then my process is more effective, I can produce at lower costs, and then from some point on it goes the other way around, I should not grow any longer. That's something we will address in class to discuss whether you find this picture convincing and whether it might be found in reality. One last argument in this chapter and in this video is about the minimum efficient scale, highlighting that there is sort of an efficient scale for the size of a firm. If a firm is too small and produces 200,000 units, but the minimum efficient scale, the MES output, is 400,000 units, then this firm should become bigger because they are not competitive, they cannot compete on the market. If they stay that small, they might disappear from markets. And this is something that we see every day, that firms go together because having been competitors before, but not being able to compete efficiently enough, either they are eliminated by the market because they cannot offer the goods for this price, or they cannot make profit for that price, or they go together with others. That might be an active thing, that might be an acquisition, that might be a takeover, and so on. But this minimum efficient scale is where firms should be in order to produce on a good level. Some importance of the MES, of the minimum efficient scale, what we said, they might merge in order to achieve again cost advantages over rivals. They might diversify and so on. Okay, so much for the theoretical parts of this chapter that we wanted to discuss in this video. You see there are, as in most chapters, business applications, different business applications. We are going to have a look at some of them in class after having discussed the theory, after having answered your questions, and that's what we do next time when we meet in class. Thanks a lot. See you then.